So, one of the videos that YouTube has recommended to me as of late was a review actually, that Doug Walker as Nostalgia Critic did about 4 to 3 years ago. And that was on the Sonic OVA. It also recommended me, because it basically coincides with it, to the first viewing that Doug and his brother Rob did of the Sonic OVA. And it got me thinking, when we look back at that Sonic OVA, it is kind of a unique little gem, if you will, when it comes to Sonic the Hedgehog. It really is. I mean, a lot of us here in the U.S. didn't even know it existed until about 3 years after its original release in Japan. Because, basically, in Japan, it was released in 1996. Here in the U.S., it was released on home video, thanks to ADV Films, in 1999. I don't know if the VHS came first, or both the VHS and the DVD came at the same time, or the DVD came later. All we know is that we basically got our first taste of it in 1999. And the reason it was released in 1999, obviously by ADV Films, ADV Films basically got the license to distribute it here in the U.S., was basically for Sega to have, some kind of Western promotional material for the Sonic adventure. I mean, let's be honest, even if they don't straight out say that's the reason, we all know it is. We all know that that's the exact reason why, the Sonic OVA saw an American release. But when we look at the Sonic OVA, though, as a whole, like I said, it's some kind of underrated, kind of unique little gem in the Sonic franchise of animation. I mean, when you kind of look at the English translation, or at least I guess the English version of it, it tries to combine a lot of elements from, the Western side of Sonic animation. I mean, we get Robotropolis in there, or Robottropolis, or whatever they want to call it. We get that in there, thanks to, basically, we could assume Sonic SatAM in the Archie comics, as well as even Sonic Underground, because it came around, it was being developed around this time, or released around this time. But more importantly, we could probably thank Sonic SatAM in the comics as well, the Archie comics, for basically giving ADV Films and Sega, some kind of material to work with, when it came to dubbing this film. Now, what's unique about this film, though, is it has characters in here besides, the ones we know about, that being Sonic, Metal Sonic, Knuckles, Tails, Robotnik. It's got characters, outside of them that kind of never really been seen, since then. I mean, true, they've been carried on through fan fiction stories, like multi-universe crossovers. They've been carried on through fan works, adult fan works, to be honest, when it comes to a certain character. They've been carried on in some ways, and maybe even, had the people that worked on, let's say, Sonic 06 draw inspiration from from this anime as well. For a certain human character, if you kind of get what I'm getting at. But when it comes to the Sonic OVA, it's definitely something that, has its moment in history. Because even though we have had not one but two Sonic live-action films, successful films, at that, everybody would still look at this somewhat as basically the original Sonic movie. This was basically that's what it was dubbed. It was dubbed Sonic the Hedgehog the movie. Although originally it was just a 2-part OVA that got shown theatrically in theaters in Japan, as well as got, shown in 2 parts on television later on, and I think even released as such, on VHS and DVD over in Japan when it got that physical release. But, obviously a lot of fans, kind of are still mixed about it even to this day. But why? Why are they mixed about it? Well, again, I think it's because it incorporated some, not just, the characters we knew it would incorporate at that time, but also incorporate characters that basically, you're like, well, what purpose did they serve? Because at this time, believe it or not, you actually had a female protagonist you could have added outside of the Sara character. You had Amy Rose, or Rosie the Rascal as she was originally known. You had her. And having her part of the equation should have been an obvious given for them to incorporate the character into, into the OVA. But here's the thing, though. Amy Rose came in 1993. We don't know how long the OVA itself, as a whole, was in development from story to animation. So we don't know. We don't know how long it was, in, development or in production or pre-production. We don't know. But, as far as we could probably be concerned, Amy came in just a bit too late to be added in. But, you might say, well, she could have been added in. I mean, if they knew they were bringing her in, why didn't they just incorporate her, from the start? Like, if they knew she was going to be part of the video game franchise, why not just incorporate that, right off the start? And I will give you that point. That, yeah, they could have done that. I mean, there's been a lot of movies and shows and everything that have introduced characters into the limelight that basically, well, let's be honest, didn't really, have that much of a lifespan before they made their debut, outside the original source material's place. They didn't really, have much, I guess you could say, lore given to them until they got into this more expanded universe that they became part of, that they became known for. So yeah, I can get your argument there because, like I said, others have done that. Others have indeed done that. And you could look through the history of movies and shows and all that, comics, with certain characters that basically just, debuted not that long ago, were already incorporated, and you find out that the reason being is because pretty much the people that were licensing their product, to be, turned into a comic, turned into a movie, turned into a cartoon, you find out basically that they already, let those that were doing, such a deal know what was going on. They kind of let them in on the fact that, yeah, this character's going to be coming in soon as part of, such and such, new version or new continuation of the franchise. What we want you to incorporate them. And like I said, you can make the argument that they could have done the same with Amy Rose, but they didn't. Instead, we ended up getting Sara. Now, I could assume what Sara was, in my opinion, wasn't just maybe a stand-in for maybe the fact that was supposed to be Amy, but I think Sara was basically a stand-in for one of the ideas originally that they had for Sonic. Because remember, they didn't shy away from saying, hey, they wanted to give Sonic a girlfriend, so why not give him a girlfriend in Sara? Because remember, one of the original ideas for a girlfriend was a human character named Madonna. And then they changed the name of the Madonna character, kept her human, to, well, the one we know of his primary love interest, in other Sonic media, that being Sally. And then, of course, Sally became who she is. So, so one could probably assume that basically, Sara was kind of that, that stand-in for what they originally wanted to do, if they wanted to basically give Sonic a love interest. And yeah, I'm assuming that's why she was brought in. She was basically brought in to be basically their answer to Madonna, the answer to, well, we can't utilize Sally because, hey, even though we have time and we can animate her in, what sense would it make if we, gave fans this character of Sally over the one they know? Because if there's one thing we can respect, if there's one thing we can understand and respect, is that there are dubbing companies that realize, well, not just dubbing companies, but the anime companies over in Japan and other countries that when they do their own version of a character, you know, basically, if they attempt to, let's say, do their version of, let's say, a Sally or a bunny or whatever, they could make them similar to what we know them as, or they can make them completely different. I mean, Fleetway is known to have done that with Sally, let's be honest. There's no doubt about that. So, there could have been a variety of reasons. Maybe, like I said, maybe they could have done it, but they realized, well, if we do it, we're going to have to make her like this, and that's not how people know her. Because you can't tell me that in Japan, they didn't know about Sara, because they did, and they probably realized, well, if we do this with her, it's going to make her be completely different, especially if it gets brought over to the U.S., which it was. And again, I think that's another reason why Sara was, put into the role that she was. Now, when it comes to, everything else about it, I look at the fact that this was done originally in 1996, and in 1996, Sega, that is, were trying to keep themselves in basically on par, if you will, on track with the likes of Nintendo and everything by bringing out a new console. Now, they had originally done, of course, a Frankenstein job, if you will, as a lot of people put it, of basically not, making a new console, but basically making add-ons like the Sega CD, the 32X, basically to not only maybe save money, but to show that, you could have the Sega Genesis for as long as you want, the Sega Mega Drive for as long as you want, and, despite what other companies will do, and, it'll be worth every penny you've made, or you paid for it. That was the original idea, in my opinion, that Sega was so, stuck in their ways at times that they wanted to prove that their Mega Drive, their Genesis, didn't really have to go through any kind of change. They didn't have to incorporate any new console, to compete with the likes of Nintendo, to compete eventually with the likes of, Sony, to compete with the likes of Atari, even though they were trying. The thing was with the Genesis is it's a one and done, and all you have to do is just add on these little attachments that we're going to basically be bringing out for you to add on, and that's what happened. And unfortunately, when the failure of these products, let's be honest, they didn't really succeed as Sega wanted them to. When the failure of these products happened, Sega was basically left with no choice to, admit defeat. They had no choice about that. They had no choice but to admit defeat and realize that the best thing to do, hold on for a sec, while I do something. Hold on for a sec. Sorry, I had to connect my charger. My battery's getting low. But anyway, like I said, Sega was too prideful to admit that they needed to move on, and it wouldn't be till basically the failure of both the 32X and the CD that they realized they had to do it, and thus came the Sega Saturn. Now, originally they were supposed to do the Jupiter, but they basically said, "Nah, skip that, we'll go into the Saturn." And that's what they did. And that came out around the same time this movie was being released in Japan. And my assumption, and I think everybody knows this by default, just by ironicness, if you will, that, the Sonic OVA was made to basically promote the Sega Saturn. That's what it was. It was meant to promote the Sega Saturn, because one of the games released for the Saturn was Sonic 3D Blast. Even though this movie feels more like a loose adaptation of Sonic CD. Again, the only omittance is the fact that we had Sara instead of Amy Rose, and there was no Death Egg. But, who's to say? Who's to say? And then, of course, you had Knuckles, portrayed the way he was. And you got to remember, this was done at a time where Knuckles basically did befriend, or at least consider Sonic an ally in the games and somewhat in the comics and other media. But a true best friend friendship wasn't really there. the people here decided, hey, we're going to change that up. Not only we're going to give him some kind of like Australian hat to make him like a treasure hunter, instead of being the guardian of the Master Emerald, they basically decided to make him a completely different character. That's it. And a lot of people have always questioned, well, didn't they read the source material? I don't get that. That doesn't make sense. And it doesn't. It doesn't, but apparently it did lay the groundwork for that style of Knuckles to be, an inspiration for future versions of the character like Mobius years later. The one thing, though, I can say, as I got to get ready to go in and clock in for work, guys, as I wrap this up, the one thing I can say, though, in conclusion, is the Sonic OVA, it's basically like, I guess you could look at it as sort of, how do I put this? Sort of like the oddity in the family of Sonic media, multimedia. It is somewhat of an oddity, but it's a unique oddity that basically, looking back on it, is quite the gem, to kind of sit back and watch and enjoy. And if you watch it now with, let's say, these 4K and 8K televisions, and you use your HDR picture mode settings, then obviously you're going to not only get a good picture in 4K at SDR 60 frames per second like I do, because I have the movie on DVD thanks to Frank Hill. It's Frank. Not only are you going to get a good crisp 4K 60 frame per hour SDR picture, but it's going to look fresh, new, and clean. And that's what a lot of people want in their products. Let's be honest. That's what a lot of people want.